Okay, right. Hello, folks. This is episode 6 of the ClimbSci podcast with Brian Rigby.
Hey, and Tom Herbert.
Hello. Right. So tonight we are doing or hoping to have a multi-part series, and we're calling this basically recovery. So tonight we're talking about recovery part 1, and we're just discussing in a general sense what is recovery, and we're going to be leaving the methods of recovering nutritionally and otherwise to subsequent episode or episodes.
Right. And that might seem like a little bit of a strange way to approach things. Ostensibly you're listening to this podcast so that you can learn how to improve your climbing, and we'll get there. We are definitely going to approach those. But I think the better place to begin with this entire discussion is why recovery is necessary in the first place. Because I know from my own experience that I see a lot of climbers come into the gym, they're like, oh, this is my 7th day on. Or, they're at the crag and they're trying to get, they take a climbing trip and they try to get as many days out of it as possible. And so they don't take that day of recovery somewhere in the middle of it. And we're trying to set the stage, trying to make an argument for why you should be more concerned with your recovery, both in terms of training and adapting to training, and just in terms of general climbing performance in general.
Yeah, so, the recovery part of it is for some reason left out. Everybody likes to train hard. We like that feeling of pushing ourselves. We like the feeling of feeling stronger, whether it is, sending problems or just, doing as much work in the gym or in the climbing gym on the wall and things like that. And we know that for training adaptations to happen, we have to progressively do more work. And specific adaptation requires us to do more specific things. So if you're wanting to get stronger, you need to do strength training. But what sometimes gets left is that, and I think, everybody does this, is that we just push and push and push ourselves, and inevitably something breaks, whether it is that we just get incredibly fatigued, or we get muscle damage, or we get ill, or we get an injury. So what we want to try and basically do tonight, as in terms of a discussion, is to try and give you some things to think about in terms of balancing this. And the interesting thing as well is that this is kind of a subjective thing. There is no one size fits all. Some people can handle much heavier workloads than others. And this is something where there's a lot of trial and error in it. But this doesn't mean that you can forego recovery strategies. What it means is that actually we want to highlight that putting these things in place are really going to augment what you can do. If you can already handle a really high training load, by putting in the best recovery strategies you can, means that you can actually do a lot more. And that doesn't mean just do a lot more over the long term, but you can do a lot more in the sessions that you have. So, yeah, carry on, Brian.
Right. The other thing I wanted to mention is that when we're talking about recovery, what you're recovering from is essentially fatigue. It's the acute physiological changes that occur during exercise. And one of the interesting and frustrating things about that is we're still don't have a solid grasp on everything that's happening. And by we, I mean the sports science community. There's been a lot of proposed mechanisms. If you even just look at fatigue, for example, like what causes fatigue in a single session of exercise or of climbing. And there's a lot of potential culprits. And we're pretty sure, that a number of these culprits play a very real role, but we're not really capable of saying how large of an effect each one of these individually is having, or if one of them is sufficient in and of itself to cause these. And the same thing transfers over to the cause of longer term fatigue, or the type of fatigue that you would need recovery from. And so Tom and I will be discussing some of these mechanisms, but it should be noted that it's in addition to being individual, it's also somewhat what's the word? Still somewhat unknown. These factors, we know that they do play a role, but you shouldn't ask us to say quantitatively how large of a role. We'll definitely try to give you like a term or like a size of an effect. Like this is going to have a more major role in recovery or in that the prior fatigue, or this will have a lesser role. But it's not like we can say if you do this one thing, then you are going to recover X faster. We just simply don't have that type of information.
Yeah. I mean, just to highlight, simply just talking about muscle soreness, or what we call DOMS. Science doesn't really understand fully what causes that, nor do we have really understanding of how we can mitigate that. So this is actually a fairly new science trying to get the grasp of it. And the big thing about it is that it's super important for sports science to understand, because fundamentally, if they can get athletes to be able to do more training and recover better, then obviously they're going to get better. So as Brian highlighted, so we can kind of talk about two things. We've got the acute recovery. So acute, you can think about in terms of just the repeated bouts of the exercise. So that can be within minutes, right? Or even seconds. So if you're doing, for instance, pull-ups, you need to recover before being able to do more pull-ups. That can then be extended a little bit further. Say you're in a competition scenario, how do you recover between the climbs that you're doing, or even between the attempts during that 2 minutes if you're bouldering or something like that. And then we have the prolonged recovery, which is restoring function or returning to play. That's part of the kind of training adaptation that would also factor into terms of how you would periodize your training so that you can recover from more overreaching periods where you're doing far more, or being fully recovered before you go into something like a competition. But and what's interesting is interventions for acute recovery can actually impact prolonged recovery, and I'll talk about that a little bit later. But there are times when we may want to do things that help us recover fast in the acute window, but we wouldn't want to do that all the time, because that would actually impact the long-term recovery. But let's start with what is happening in basically on a physiological level in the tissues. So Brian, do you want to talk about basically the acute physiological response to exercise?
Yeah, I do. So there's a variety of things happening, and I was going to take it from kind of the largest thing, not largest necessarily in terms of how it affects you, but largest in terms of the scale. So I was going to start with muscle glycogen depletion, which is something that we can readily measure, we know happens, and we know contributes to fatigue. So all exercise depletes muscle glycogen. Our muscles have a certain store of glycogen. That store depends on essentially on how much carbohydrate you eat in your daily diet, as well as how much you train. More training and more carbohydrates is going to lead to higher muscle glycogen stores as you train your body essentially to use carbohydrates more prevalently during that exercise. And as you exercise, our body taps into that energy store and starts depleting it. Different types of exercise deplete muscle glycogen at different rates. The faster the intensity, the more anaerobic the exercise is, the faster that muscle glycogen depletes. Not because you're using the entire carbohydrate molecule, or the entire glucose molecule after you free it from that chain of glycogen, but rather because you only get a little bit of energy out of the breakdown of glucose to pyruvate, and then the pyruvate gets reduced to lactate, and the lactate is, from an energy standpoint, functionally useless to us while we're exercising. So you only get a little bit, and then if we were to derive all the energy from that carbohydrate, from that glucose molecule, then we actually have to run it through the aerobic energy cycle. And since that's not really available to us during anaerobic exercise, we wind up with a large number of lactate molecules that will have to later be either regenerated back into muscle glycogen or into glucose through the Cori cycle, or they could potentially feed other systems within our body, such as our red blood cells. So again, the faster pace, the higher intensity, more intermittent exercise is going to deplete muscle glycogen faster, because it's going to have a higher, you have a higher need for instant energy, but you will be able to recover some of those stores later on. Whereas if you're doing more steady state exercise, you're going to deplete the muscle glycogen by a larger percent, just because you're going to be fully using those glucose molecules. You're going to be processing them all the way through the citric acid cycle. You're going to be aerobically processing them. So they are, in that sense, they're gone forever. Whereas when you process them anaerobically, they're gone only temporarily.
Yeah. So folks, if you just remember, the reason that this is the case is the rate of energy turnover, or the rate of cleaving energy from the substrate. So the reason we can't use fatty acids for energy at high intensities is we simply can't deliver oxygen fast enough to the cells, and the cycle, or the metabolic breakdown, is slower than that of the anaerobic substrates like creatine and glycogen. So that's what Brian is saying, is that the reason we use more glycogen at higher intensities is because this is the substrate that can provide the energy at the rate that we need it. Though fatty acids provide more energy per molecule, it cannot be turned over quick enough to provide the energy, the ATP, to the working muscles. So that's why glycogen gets used at higher and higher intensities. Yeah.
Right. And there's also just the improved oxygen efficiency of the glycogen molecule in general, which means that aerobic exercise will favor its use if you have it available. So even if you're not doing super high intensity, you will, of course, still be burning fat. You're always burning fat. It's a myth that there's ever a time that your body's not burning fat, at least until you die. But it's a little morbid, sorry. But you will, if you have a higher carbohydrate diet, if you have the muscle glycogen available, your body will use it. So we know that as you continue exercising, you're going to start depleting these stores. And how much you actually deplete them by is going to be very much dependent on you and the exercise you're doing. Again, the more carbohydrate you consume, the more carbohydrate reliant you are, the faster you're going to potentially be consuming those stores. But then at the same time, the larger stores you're likely to have. So it could somewhat equal out in the end. If you're on a lower carbohydrate diet or a high fat diet, you're not going to use those carbohydrate stores as readily, but you also have very small stores. Overall, we can say that an hour of exercise is going to deplete your muscle glycogen by around 50 to 70%.
Depending on obviously what you're doing.
Right. So again, that's going to depend on intensity. It's going to do, if it's an hour of light walking, you're not going to deplete your muscle glycogen by that much, because your body will be using fat to a greater extent. But if this is, well, I would say prolonged steady state exercise, something that's making your heart beat, it's going to be around that number. If you're doing bursts, you can actually deplete your glycogen by 20 to 25% within 30 seconds. So very, very rapid depletion. But again, it's a little hard to say that that's actual. I wouldn't say that's true muscle glycogen depletion, because after those 30 seconds are up and you stop and you're breathing really hard, your body isn't just leaving that glucose broken down and reduced into lactate stranded, it's going to actually regenerate that either through glyconeogenesis, which would be resynthesizing glucose back from those lactate molecules, or your body's going to use the Cori cycle, which is essentially shuttling lactate out of the muscle cells over to the liver. The liver then is very capable of turning lactate back into glucose, which it releases back into the bloodstream, and the muscles will take it back up. So a little bit of a longer process to get glucose back to the muscles, but we know that both of these play a role in replenishing glycogen within minutes after a high intensity exercise. So I think it's a little bit of a misstatement to say that high intensity exercise will deplete muscle glycogen by 20 to 25% in 30 seconds, because while that's true, if you measured it 30 seconds after exercise or after those 30 seconds immediately, it's probably not true in a short period of recovery. Although you will certainly have burned some of that glycogen. So that's actually a number that I was not able to find a reference on how much glycogen we would burn after, let's say, 30 seconds of all out effort and then 5 minutes of recovery, how much muscle glycogen has been used effectively. But I think that's why I think it's maybe a little bit better to rely on this like over an hour figure of 50, 70%. Even if you're doing higher intensity exercise, probably most exercise that you could do in repeated bouts for an hour is going to deplete, or either in repeated bouts throughout the course of an hour, or steady state the entire time for that hour is probably going to deplete similar amounts of muscle glycogen.
Yeah, I mean, the other thing as well is that it's not just muscle glycogen that is going to cause you to not do repeated bouts. So
Right.
this is the thing, is that you unless you're doing a marathon, a literal marathon, it's very unlikely that you will ever get to a point where you have so-called depleted your muscle glycogen to such a point that you can no longer do any work. So by that I mean there's going to be other factors involved in causing fatigue that is going to prevent you from doing more work. There's only a few people who have got to incredibly low glycogen levels, and those are the guys you see at the end of marathons where they look basically drunk. That's what they would be called as, they call it bonking here in the UK.
Yeah, we call it that here too.
Yeah. So it's unlikely that climbers are probably going to get to this point. But that also brings up the point that glycogen is localized. So you can't once glucose makes it into your muscle tissue, it changes its molecular shape, which prevents it being released out of the muscle. Whereas the liver, which has glycogen, that has a different form of the molecule, which is why whenever you're not, you don't have other glucose coming into the system, dietary glucose, then your liver will then release that glucose into your bloodstream to support the body's need for glucose. So what that means is, and I think we brought it up in the substrate podcast, is that your need for glycogen is going to be dependent on the activity performed by the muscles. So, you're not going to deplete your upper body glycogen if you're running, and vice versa.
Right. And we should say also, I'm going to add to what you were saying about climbers not depleting their glycogen. It's true. I mean, we don't usually experience situations where you've completely depleted your muscles of glycogen, but that's also not the requirement for low glycogen to cause fatigue or to start fatiguing. As you exercise and as glycogen levels decrease, you actually start having lower force production. So muscle glycogen, even lower muscle glycogen, even when it's not depleted, is going to have an impact upon your ability to exercise. And if you begin exercise in a low glycogen state, at least if you begin exercise in a low glycogen state, whereas your body would normally be accustomed to a higher glycogen state, you're also going to have lower force production and a more rapid onset of fatigue.
Right.
So
yeah, carry on.
I was just going to wrap that little statement up by saying muscle glycogen is a fairly important factor when it comes to recovery, both short-term and long-term. We're looking at, we're wanting to make sure that our stores, at least in most situations, are optimal in order to get the most out of our training sessions and our climbing sessions.
Yeah, exactly. And I think this is the greatest determinant of sports performance and length of performance. This really is the glycogen availability in your muscles really is the greatest determinant of performance overall. This comes up in almost all papers that looks at what is the determinant of power output and of length of whatever you're doing in terms of exercise length.
Right. And it's kind of tricky in some ways, I think, because it's, as I mentioned earlier, it's so easily measured and it's such a big difference. Your muscles, even just your climbing specific muscles, you might have 200 grams of muscle glycogen. And when you deplete it, you're talking about, maybe you're only spending about 100 of that 200 grams, but that's a major difference from the beginning of exercise to the end of exercise. That's a major physiological change within your muscles, especially compared to some of these other things that we suspect or know contribute to fatigue, like inorganic phosphate levels or, the levels of creatine phosphate. Those are all so much more minor. And it's not that they're not contributing to them, but they are, I guess they're just so much smaller in scale that I think we tend to not focus as much on their roles and maybe suspect that the roles are overall lesser compared to the role of muscle glycogen.
Do you want to talk about lactic acid at this point at all?
Oh, in what sense? I mean,
well, just in terms of differentiating it between lactate, because you've mentioned lactate a lot now.
Yeah. I mean, there's lactate. If I recall my physiology, lactate's actually what we find within our body. Our body reduces pyruvate to lactate. Essentially, it needs to regenerate this NAD molecule to NADH. And the only way it can do that is by essentially reducing the pyruvate into lactate, which preempts the pyruvate from being able to be run through the citric acid cycle, which would normally do the same thing, but it's a necessary condition. It's actually beneficial. You might hear like lactic acidosis. That's, I don't know how much is being thrown around these days, but I know that even 5 years ago, when you asked people like, oh, what's the cause of that burn that you feel in your muscles? Oh, it's lactic acidosis. And actually, if you asked a random person on the street today, they'd give you the same response. They'd say, oh, that's lactic acidosis. But we know that now. We're very certain that it's not actually lactic acidosis. Number one, because as I just mentioned, our body isn't producing lactic acid, it's producing lactate. So it would be a misnomer at the very best. But more specifically, the conversion of pyruvate to lactate is beneficial. It actually reduces our acid load within our muscles because it's absorbing a proton, and the protons are the cause of the intramuscular acidity. So it'd be really, in a sense, because like the backwards argument for why you could still say it's lactic acidosis is because you are basically freeing, because you're taking up a proton, and because you through this whole process have regenerated another ATP, that now you can spend that ATP and produce 2 new protons. So basically the argument would be because you've run this glucose molecule down into lactate, even though you absorbed 1 proton per pyruvate in the process, for each one that you absorb, you create the potential to create 2 new ones. But I think that's kind of a kind of a dumb argument because anytime you're burning energy, you're producing protons. That's just a consequence of energy production within the muscles. And it's only through the citric acid cycle that we can soak up enough of those protons in order to not have ongoing acid load within the muscles. So saying that by that anaerobic glycolysis leading to lactate leads to increased acid load is very circular thinking, because no matter where you begin, you're beginning with the creation of same thing with like when you break the creatine phosphate down. Creatine phosphate regenerates in ATP, and then what does that ATP? What happens when you break that ATP down into ADP? You release a proton. So it's not like you've avoided anything by using a different energy source. And it comes full circle again, because once you regenerate that creatine to creatine phosphate, you absorb a proton. So the reason we experience increasing levels of acidity in the muscles as exercise goes on isn't because of lactic acid. That is the summary of what I'm saying. It's because you're doing exercise, and because the exercise you're doing, particularly for high intensity activities like climbing, it's because those exercises are producing so many more protons than your body is capable of removing in a short period of time.
Yeah, and basically you see a scale, like a linear scale of this lactate going up. So that's why you do lactate threshold training or lactate testing, is that as these things obviously correlate as you're producing it. So I think early on that's what they were looking at, and they were saying, oh, okay, this is obviously a byproduct of exercise, specifically high intensity exercise. So it must be a bad thing because people are getting fatigued. Lo and behold, we discovered that actually it's the complete opposite. This is actually a substrate for energy and it's even doing the opposite of what we thought it was doing, and it's actually a buffer. So the big thing is that the burn that you're feeling when you're doing exercise is not lactic acid. Just drop that from your vocabulary. And no one really uses that anymore. The lactate that you produce is a byproduct and is shuttled around and used. And the hydrogen ions that are building up are causing that burn, along with other factors.
Just be cool like Tom and me and say, oh, you got excess hydrogen in your muscles or too many protons floating around.
That's right.
People won't know what you're talking about, but you'll technically be correct.
Yeah.
So that's kind of the frustrating thing about lactic acidosis, is that everyone knows what you're talking about when you say that, but you're also wrong. So I think we've reached this kind of strange point where I want to call it lactic acidosis, not because it's accurate, but just because I know I'll be understood if I mention that. Whereas I also know that if I say, that burning is caused by excess hydrogen ions, that most people, in my experience, have given me a kind of a strange look and moved on. So I haven't actually been able to make any point beyond that. It's tough. You don't really want to begin every single discussion of fatigue with an explanation of how acidity in the muscles works, but I don't know. Maybe 10 years from now we won't have to.
No, and that's the whole reason that we talk like this, and this kind of mix of being a little bit technical and a little bit practical, is we're trying to make this as a bit of a conversation, and to give people who don't really think about this sort of stuff something to think about. And I hopefully will go and look this sort of stuff up and investigate themselves and understand a bit more about it. But very much about the way that we talk like this is we're trying to have a conversation about a topic, and hopefully be interesting enough for you guys to go, oh, okay, I haven't thought of that before. I haven't heard that before, or like, what the hell is he talking about, the TCA cycle, and go and understand it. Because to be honest, it's not that difficult to understand. And it's super interesting when you get into this stuff. You don't have to have a university background to get interested in all of this physiology. But the other thing about it is there's this difference between understanding the kind of rocket biology and the application of how we mentioned numbers about glycogen use in your muscles. Does it make any difference whether it is 38.7% that you've reduced after your session, or 52%? No, but you just need to know that you are reducing your glycogen, and that's what we want to try and get across to you. That things are happening, and you need to mitigate these things to help do more work.
Exactly. Yeah. Or if you don't need to, then at least there's a benefit to, yeah, exactly what Tom said. You don't necessarily need to know the specifics. You don't need to be able to dial in exactly how much of this or that is happening. You just need to know that it is, and that there are steps, which we'll discuss later, that you can take to mitigate or ameliorate them.
Okay, so now to preface this next little section for Brian, any of you who have done and this is most commonly done if you do something like a high intensity body weight workout or like sprint intervals, is this effect that during the actual exercise, say for instance a sprint, you seem to be incredibly powerful, and if you notice, you're probably not breathing that much, but then you suddenly stop and you're bent over double and you're gasping for air. So Brian, do you want to talk about this, what we call EPOC?
Yeah, EPOC, or excess post-exercise oxygen consumption. This is, after we look at glycogen, this is maybe the next largest effect that we're going to notice, or next most measurable, something that we know happens, and we know it happens 100% of the time. But again, the scale of how much it happens and how much of an effect it has, that's a little bit dicier or a little bit more unknown. So there's a little bit of history to this. We used to call this the oxygen debt, the excess post-exercise oxygen consumption. Now we're more inclined to call it the recovery oxygen period or recovery oxygen requirement. We used to call it an oxygen debt because the leading theory for why we needed, why you breathed so much harder after exercise and why your heart rate increases post-exercise is that, and it can make, or I should say stays elevated post-exercise, is because we needed to regenerate. Essentially, we took out a loan on our energy stores, and that loan was in the form of breaking glycogen, breaking glucose down to pyruvate and then to lactate. And then to restore those, we needed oxygen, which is true. We do need oxygen to regenerate lactate to a glycogen molecule or to glucose within the Cori cycle. But as more studies were conducted, we realized that it's not a very significant portion of our excess post-exercise oxygen consumption. And so it's not really fair to say it's an oxygen debt, because it's less than 10% of that debt is the recovery of lactate or of creatine phosphate. Basically, of any of our anaerobic stores, the regeneration of those is with oxygen, post-exercise oxygen, is not particularly high. So I wanted to preface I wanted to put a tag on on Tom's preface just by saying that oxygen debt isn't really preferred anymore. But what we do know is that after you finish, you do have a higher oxygen consumption, not just immediately after, which you are certain to notice. As Tom mentioned, if you sprint for 30 seconds or a minute, when you stop, you're breathing very hard. And you're breathing hard concomitant to how hard you've just exercised. But you'll actually continue consuming greater amounts of exercise oxygen depending on how much of this exercise you do for hours potentially afterwards. Sometimes it's suggested even a day or two of a slight increase in oxygen. And we're not 100% certain where all of this extra oxygen, where the need for all this extra oxygen comes from or why it's happening. But we have a few theories. The biggest component that most people that I've seen arguing online now, or in papers, when I say online, I don't mean in random forums. I meant scientists in published journals. One of the bigger things that they're thinking is happening is that in this post-exercise period, your body has shifted from the oxidation of carbohydrates to fats as a primary fuel, which is great if your goal is fat loss, and just great in general, because we have virtually unlimited stores of fat, but carbohydrates were limited in our both our storage and consumption of. But if you might recall, fats require slightly more oxygen to burn than carbohydrates, approximately 10% more. So if you shift from carbohydrate to fat oxidation in your day-to-day activities in this recovery period, then you are, in essence, increasing how much oxygen you need to consume. So I guess the disappointing thing when you look at it this way is you're not actually, you might have heard, like, seen graphs or whatever, people saying the calories you burn are so much higher in this epoch period of time. That's the true benefit of high intensity interval training, that you might not burn a ton of calories during it, but afterwards you're burning so many calories, and you will be burning more calories. But we should account for the fact that if your body is shifting from carbohydrate to fat oxidation, then your oxygen requirements have increased, but your caloric requirements have stayed. The amount of calories you're burning have actually stayed fairly static from one to the other. It's not like just because you've shifted from carbs to fat that you're burning more calories. You're burning the same number of calories. You require the same number of calories for recovery and for your daily activity. You just have shifted substrates, and that the substrate that you have shifted to requires more oxygen to oxidize.
Yeah, and I think the point being is that it becomes very trendy to think that you have to do high intensity workouts to be, these are the fat burning, fat smashing workouts. Apart from the training adaptation that's caused by them, and they're very what's the word, time efficient. They aren't, you don't have to do a gazillion kettlebell swings to be, maximally burn fat.
Right. Although you do have to be doing kettlebell swings if you're doing a high intensity interval training, because they are always there.
That and burpees.
Yeah, no, it's true. We're not wrapping on high intensity interval training, because it can be a very efficient way to do a workout, and there's certainly merit to it as a workout. It's more combating, as we do for any topic, the notion that one method of exercise is inherently superior to any other form for a certain purpose. So when we're talking about fat burning, it's not that high intensity interval training is not going to be effective. It will be. It's just probably not going to be more effective than other types of training as well.
Yeah.
There's no major increase in calories burned in this post-exercise period compared to doing climbing, or, compared to taxing your system in a similar manner through other types of exercise.
Yeah. And I mean, I think the most I've ever seen on a calorie burn for a high intensity interval session is like 350 calories or something, and like a Kit Kat is about, if you eat a Kit Kat, it's about 250 calories. So just from an energy standpoint, and we'll do a whole podcast on fat loss specifically, but let's move on before we rant a little bit too much about.
Sure. Well, I just wanted to wrap up a little more that, this oxygen recovery, it's not just the shifting of the substrate. I think we can wrap up the excess oxygen consumption in the post-recovery period as saying that your body adapts to training, and adaptation requires energy. The various metabolic and hormonal changes that exercise has induced, the muscle growth period, the muscle recovery, the replenishment of glycogen, all of these factors together require oxygen, because the metabolism of energy requires oxygen, at least when you're not doing it anaerobically, and our body really does not want to burn energy anaerobically except for when it has to. So we can sum it up by saying, I think we can sum up post-exercise oxygen consumption, or the recovery oxygen period, as you've done work, you've inspired adaptation within your body, and in order to fulfill those adaptations, your oxygen requirements have slightly increased. And then there are maybe some very specific ways, like the shift from carbohydrate to fat oxidation, that will increase it that much more. But really what we're talking about is an adaptation period. And during that adaptation period, you have greater oxygen requirements, just as a matter of course.
Yeah. Okay. Actually, here's a question for you. Do you think, so I've sometimes done like a stare test. If I'm feeling particularly diligent, I'll walk up the 7 flights of stairs on a regular basis to the office, right?
Mm-hmm.
And I've always wondered whether or not your post-exercise or post-stair climbing oxygen consumption, there's an indication of your fitness level, i.e., if you are fitter, would you be breathing less after doing the same amount of exercise?
Whew. I mean, I guess it's I would say in aggregate, like if you had enough people doing this test, you should be able to make the correlation that those breathing less hard after climbing 7 flights of stairs are in general more aerobically fit. And I specify aerobically fit because maybe they, don't lift at all, bro. We should be able to note that a correlation that they are more aerobically fit, but that's only in aggregate. I think that if you look at yourself as an individual, you could say, okay, if I continue doing this day to day, if I get more aerobically fit, then yeah, those 7 flights of stairs will tax you less, because you'll develop your muscles will adapt in such a way that you become more efficient. You're going to use, if not use less oxygen, then you're going to just be able to consume and maintain that energy level for that 7 flights of stairs in a better manner. If you compare yourself to a random other person, though, I don't know if you can really make that type of call, because heart rates vary so much, and heart rates vary based on oxygen consumption. It's not like hearts are beating fast or slow for no reason. It just depends on how much oxygen your body needs to deliver. And it's not like we can look at a heart rate and use that one single measure as an indication of how aerobically fit somebody is, because heart rates, even between professional athletes, professional aerobic athletes, professional marathoners, they're going to vary. It's not like you could take the heart rate of a marathoner and be like, okay, you're 1 beat per minute slower than this other guy, so you should be able to run that much faster or that much more efficiently.
Yeah, I mean, we obviously have, there's something called heart rate recovery, and that can be one means of showing the adaptation or the recovery from a bout of exercise. And that simply is what it sounds like, is that and this is something that you can actually do yourself. If you do some sort of exercise and then see how quickly your heart, so if you take your heart rate before you say, let's do the stairs. So you take your heart rate before you do the stairs, you climb the stairs, and then you time the amount, or you time the time that it takes for your heart to go back to baseline, to where you were before. And that can indicate a change in your recovery. And that's also related to kind of the parasympathetic sympathetic system, which I'll talk a little bit about later, and how that actually can directly affect your recovery time.
Right. Yeah, I hadn't included some of that. Like, I had read about it and, I'm aware of it, but I didn't include it in my notes, just because one thing that I had been reading was that it, like, not only is it highly individual, but it can also just vary depending on what period of your training you're in. So it's sometimes like your heart rate recovery will improve after training, and sometimes it'll go down. And it's really, you need more personal information. So it's something that you could work with a coach probably and kind of dial in as a factor impacting your recovery, general recovery, not just heart rate recovery, and as part of a training periodization. But it's maybe less useful as just a single measure, shot out into the dark. It's something you need more data, and preferably somebody that is experienced in interpreting that data to, find meaning in.
Yeah, and I'll mention the heart rate variability actually at the end of this, if we have a little bit of time. As well. Okay, so this is a great one, because this is something that is a kind of mysterious annoyance, and one that we've all experienced, and it is annoying, and can be quite severe at times. And this is the dreaded DOMS, or delayed or exercise-induced muscle damage, delayed onset muscle damage. So where should we start with this? So in brief, this is the muscle soreness in general. What you feel sort of generally more than 8 hours, sort of 48 hours after you do an exercise, and it most commonly occurs when you do an exercise that you haven't done before, or in a different method. So, for instance, say you were to do stiff leg deadlifts, or eccentrically, or you suddenly do a whole bunch of glute work, which you don't normally do. Or, for instance, say you start running up hills and you're not much of a runner. You're fine for like a day, and then like if you do it on a Monday, for some reason Wednesday comes along and you're walking like you've got a carrot up your ass. And yeah, it's very annoying. And what's interesting about it is that we don't really understand what's going on. What we do know is it's not really what we think, what people generally think it is. It's not as much muscle damage as we think it is muscle damage. So delayed onset muscle soreness is not that you've done a really heavy workout and you've shredded your muscles, or your muscle fibers. That's actually not what's causing the problem. Though doing things like eccentric, so they've done studies where they've done exercise bouts, concentric, typical exercise resistance training bouts, and they've looked at the muscle tissue, and the muscle tissue doesn't look that different post and pre and post. What it does look different though is if you're doing things like eccentric. So the eccentric is obviously that lowering portion of the exercise. There they have seen that actually the muscle fibers get messed up a lot, which is one of the reasons why if you do a bout of heavy eccentric training, it actually takes you much longer to recover from, which is something to note. That I'm a big fan of eccentric training. Anyone who trains with me knows that I put a lot of it in, but we have to put it in carefully, because if you're going to be climbing 2 days later and I've done a whole bunch of eccentric stuff with you, you're going to hate me for it. So so in that sense, there is a lot of muscle damage, but from what I understand, and it's going to be interesting to hear Brian's take on this, is that it's really kind of related to the pain receptors. And actually what exercise does, or novel exercise does, is that it can be damaging kind of cell membranes, and it's the kind of inflammation, or these molecules, these cytokines, these different metabolites that are building up and are coming into play over the 48 hours, which are coming into contact with these damaged cell membranes and triggering these nociceptors. I think that's what they're called, right? Nerve endings. Yeah. And this is what's stimulating the pain. So it's not that the muscles are being teared as much, but they are maybe swelling and becoming inflamed, as any exercise is going to be doing. And it's this that is actually it's these combination of these two things that are causing this sensation of pain and stiffness.
Yeah, I don't have a lot to add on, specifically on delayed onset muscle soreness. This whole section is the last part of my notes, because it's definitely feels the most tenuous. We just don't have a great explanation for why delayed onset muscle soreness happens. And you hear words like micro tears and micro trauma tossed around. And I mean, for sure, as Tom mentioned, if you look at studies, especially on eccentric exercise, you do see that. And we know that probably plays somewhat of a role, because you tend to get DOMS more frequently from eccentric exercise. You don't tend to get it from concentric exercises, but it doesn't really explain all of it. And I mean, you can also see like you can have eccentric exercise without DOMS.
Yeah, exactly.
You can have these micro trauma. You can have, damage and inflammation of the muscles and not actually suffer from any soreness. So even if that plays a role in it, it's neither necessary nor sufficient to cause the exercise induced soreness. So it's
Yeah,
kind of a conundrum, and that's why it's last on my list. It's not because this isn't a factor. It's not that it's not going to play a factor in your recovery, but it's the hardest to pin down why it's going to play a factor. As I have a decent amount to discuss in the next episode in regards to that. About like the role of the creation of reactive oxygen species, for example, within your muscles, and the role of inflammation in your muscles as a part of the both recovery from exercise and adaptation to that exercise. I've got more to say about that than I have to say about, the general cause
yeah,
of it.
yeah. And it's an interesting thing because I mean, everyone has experienced DOMS for so long, but we still we don't really have. And if you do a Google to try and find some real answers to why it happens, it's really all over the place, which is cool. I mean, it's fascinating. There's these parts of exercise physiology and science that we really don't have a grasp on, and it's going to be very cool when we work out the best way of mitigating this. I think what we can say is that what's interesting is that it certainly seems to be novel exercises tend to cause DOMS more than others, meaning
Right.
that certainly doing things that you're not used to doing tends to cause problems, as does, I think, maybe just the volume of work you do. The other thing that's important to know is that DOMS is not a good indication that you've worked hard enough. So, though we're not, climbers are not wanting to pack on muscle, and for people who are trying to get jacked, there's this feeling that you have to work the muscle to the point of being in pain the next day. Typical kind of leg day. If you're walking badly the next day, then you've obviously done enough work for your legs to grow. That really is not the case. There's no correlation between DOMS and muscle growth. If anything, if you're continually doing exercise where you are feeling damaged, in quotes, you're doing it probably wrong. You don't need to damage the muscles to grow. They've actually done studies where they've put, I think they put like compression cuffs on muscles to cause damage without actually using the muscle. And this did not cause hypertrophy to the same extent. So though muscle damage or muscle fiber damage and recruiting of different fibers is part and parcel of muscle growth or muscle hypertrophy, it's not the means by which you should chase. So don't do your training chasing the pain. No pain, no gain is not a smart idea. And that actually goes into the whole recovery thing, right? And this is actually the big thing is, one, you need, I'm not telling people off here. I'm just saying what is useful. Right? Sometimes I feel like I'm,
listen up, guys. What Tom's about to tell you is critical, and if you ignore it, you're being a fool. Take it away, Tom.
All right. All I'm saying is that I've spoken to a lot of people over time, and that one of the things that people don't do, or some people don't do, is they don't have any journal of what they're doing in terms of their training, right? It depends on where you are and what you're wanting as your goals as a climber, right? If you're climbing for fun and you don't really care whether you're progressively training, etc., then this obviously doesn't apply. But I will encourage you to literally just keep a journal of what you're doing at the gym or in the climbing center, and some subjective scores. So, for instance, what I do with all my workouts and with my clients is I ask them to rate out of 10 how hard that group of exercises were. So if I do 3 sets of whatever, 5, at the end of it, I say, how hard was that? And they say it's like an 8 out of 10, then I know they're working hard enough, and we have a measure of how that was for them. If they come in and they say that was a 9, and then the next time they come in and they say that was a 9, and the next time they come in and they say that was like a 9.5, then I know something's not right. Either they're not recovering, or I have set the bar too high for what they're trying to do, right? So the reason I say that they call this rating of perceived exertion, right? This is something that you can use as you're exercising to try and make sure you're training hard enough. So I always try and get people to say that they should work at about 8 out of 10 on effort for most of the stuff they're doing. But also it can show you, when you look at your page of exercises at the end of your session, to see whether or not the exercises are too much of a load for you. And the reason I'm saying this is that, and this is where it becomes subjective, is that you need to have a look over time of what you're doing versus the training load and your recovery. Because there are sometimes points where you will feel really fantastic and push yourself and compress a huge amount of training load into a small period, and then feel like rubbish 2 weeks later or 3 weeks, however long this block is, and end up not doing very much training because you're either fatigued or you have really bad DOMs, or et cetera, et cetera. So if we go straight back to and talk about the DOMs thing, say you go in and you blast a 2-hour session of some crazy workout that you're doing, and then 2 days later you can hardly walk, and then by like 4 days later you're a little bit back to what and you go back and try and train again. You're not going to be unlikely to put in the same amount of training you did. Whereas actually, if you monitored how much you're doing, you can actually prolong your training period over much longer, meaning that you're training smart rather than just training intense. And the other things that you can think about in terms of seeing whether or not you need to push and pull yourself back from your training load, and understanding your balance between recovery and training, is this kind of keeping of a diary. And you can have a look at your sleep. What time are you going to bed? Now, I don't want to, some of these things we're going to cover specifically, but in the next thing of how we mitigate this stuff. But start keeping mood scores. So you can, for instance, you can keep how the exercise or the session felt. Your motivation to go to train is another indicator of whether or not you're recovered. How well you slept at night, how many hours you felt you slept. Hunger is another thing. Your libido is another thing. There's many different things that you can take on a subjective, and you can't compare these to somebody else, but you can, when you look at your training diary and you notice that you had some really amazing training sessions with loads of volume, and then 2 weeks later you notice that, for instance, your sleep sucks and your libido is really bad and you're constantly hungry and you're very cold the whole time, and maybe you're getting the sniffles, then you can start understanding the kind of pattern of where you can push yourself hard enough and when you need to recover, and what types of training. If you're doing circuit board stuff, then you might need not the same amount of recovery that you do if you're doing a heavy boulder session or if you're doing strength training. And this can also impact as well, and maybe we need to do a show on how to optimally position your types of training to get the most out of this. But anyway, what I'm trying to say is that there are very low-tech ways that you can actually understand whether or not you're recovering well. And this would be probably a good thing for you to start doing, especially if we're going to come at the end of the next month with methods we feel are proven to help you get better, to recover better. And maybe you can compare the two or something like that.
Right. Yeah, I think some of what Tom was mentioning there, you would call there's overreaching and there's overtraining. And overreaching is something that, to progress, you have to overreach a little bit, but you also have to be able to pull it back and recover. Because when you continue down the road of overreaching and overreaching some more and overreaching yet more, then you can eventually find yourself into overtraining. But even if you don't quite get to such a drastic point that you enter this overtrained state, which would mean months of essentially recovering, months where you are not functioning very well. But even within these overreach, you have to recover from those overreached points in between, because you have decreased performance. You will, day to day, your performance will decrease. So even if it feels like you're getting more in, and I think this is, it's maybe a little bit outside the scope of what we're talking about in terms of recovery, but I think it is important to at least mention, because essentially what we want when we make the argument for why you need recovery, we're making the argument that you're actually going to achieve more training. You can measure your training and the quality of your training in a variety of ways, but I think Tom would probably agree that if you're just measuring quantity, then you're doing it wrong.
Yeah.
Because if you're just looking, oh, I climbed 3 hours, today, and then 3 hours the next day, and across like a 7-day period, you have been put like 15 to 20 hours in, and maybe like if you're if your life is literally revolves around training and recovering and doing everything, if you're a professional, you're being paid for this, then there might be periods when that's relevant. But for the average person, if you're just measuring quantity and you're saying this is how many hours I put in, then maybe you could have cut half those hours out and improved the quality of each of those hours as a result and gotten so much more out of it. And that's where the recovery period comes in. That's what recovery is so critical for. It's allowing you to get more out of your training.
Yeah. And here's an example, right, of it in a very acute sense. If I ask you to do pull-ups and I say, do 5 sets of pull-ups to failure, right? You're going to do a certain amount of volume, but depending on how long you leave between your sets of pull-ups is going to affect the total volume, right? But if I said to you, okay, I want you to do this many pull-ups with this much recovery, this acute recovery between pull-ups, you're going to be able to do a lot better quality pull-ups, and then probably increase the amount of pull-ups that you're going to do over time. So the recovery thing is not just recovery after exercise, but recovery within exercise itself. And we're going to talk about that in the next podcast of how we can maximize this acute recovery period with interventions or nutritional interventions and things like that. But this is just something for you to think about, and I really try and push it with my training clients, is that I really think that quality matters, and the recovery in an acute sense during the training session break, and then over the space of the week, depending on the type of training and the recovery time between training bouts, is that this is the longevity. This is what you want, training longevity. And also there's going to be a point where if you keep pushing and pushing and pushing and not optimally recovering, then your training adaptation is going to be slowed anyway, because you're never in a point where it's now flipped over to the other side, that you're always in this kind of catabolic state.
Right. Yeah, we will say, at least over here, maybe say it over there as well, but adaptation doesn't happen while you're exercising. It happens during recovery.
Yeah.
So if you're not recovering, you're not actually getting anything out of your training.
Yeah. Okay, so I've got a last little bit. So I won't talk about heart rate variability. That actually we'll talk about that maybe on the next podcast. But actually, if you are interested in heart rate variability, I have a very long article on useful.coach. It's just called Heart Rate Variability for Training and Recovery. That's probably a good place to go and look at that. One thing I do want to do, because this is something I actually looked up, is that there is a feeling that if you're older, you recover worse than if you're younger, right? There's a kind of feeling about this. So I had a look into this, and what's amazing is that there's actually very little data. From what I could find, is like 2 studies on resistance training, and And the latest one, I think, I haven't got the reference here, but I think it was a 2017 study, and they did leg resistance training with, I can't remember the ages, but I think it's like they were up to 26 and the other ones were 40 something or something like that. And what they found was, very briefly, was that what they did is they took blood draws at different time periods after the exercise to look at things like these inflammatory markers, these different metabolites in the body, in the blood, which are indicators of exercise damage, and et cetera, et cetera. And what was great about this is that there was really no significant difference between the older and the younger, all the way up to 48 hours. So what this study showed, and this is not very, we don't have very much data, but according to this study, is that there wasn't a difference at 48 hours between young and old trainers. But what one person who was commenting on the paper said was that what we don't know is whether or not over time, 72 hours and further, that the younger trainers somehow recover quicker than the older. So this is still now a kind of, this is something that we need to understand, because, you know, I mean, I was speaking to somebody who's a similar age as me, and I don't know whether or not we put this on ourselves and say, well, I'm older, so that's why everything hurts a bit more. Maybe we're just doing things badly in terms of recovery strategies, or we're maybe burning the candle at both ends, or maybe simply we're just like psychologically giving ourselves excuses for not training as hard. I mean, everybody knows that there are some stories now of people in their 50s who are sending some incredible climbs, like they've done their best climbs in their 50s than they have ever done, right? And this is really encouraging. Yeah. So, so I'm basically in the mindset now that most of my poor recovery and my poor performance is actually because I'm a wimp and I'm doing too much stuff as you do when you get older. You have more responsibilities. So what I'm saying is that according to the little bit of data that we have, at 48 hours, apparently there's no difference between being in your 20s and being in your late 30s or whatever, where the study was. What we do know, though, there is data that like over the age of 65, you do recover much slower. And but you don't generate as much muscle. You are less sensitive to protein. We spoke about in podcast number 1. So there's that.
Yeah, that's interesting. I wonder how much. Well, I mean, I think we can make a reasonable guess about how much of a role training status plays in that. Because you just mentioned like protein, for example, and the body becomes less sensitive to protein as you age. But a great way to keep that sensitivity is to train, is to exercise. So the difference is always more stark when you measure like a 20-year-old and a 60-year-old at an untrained status, or a trained 20-year-old and an untrained 60-year-old, than it is between a trained 20-year-old and a trained 60-year-old. And it's interesting. Certainly we know that, it's not like a cliff where you recover perfectly fine, and then one day you hit 65 and it all drops off. There must be some grade there, but it would be interesting to see some data that tells us about how much just exercising, just doing your activity is going to improve your recovery.
Yeah, I mean, I think this, I mean, it's slightly aside from the recovery thing, but I think to encourage people is there doesn't seem to be much science to say that as you get older, you get worse at everything.
Yeah.
In brain science, we see that you're not losing brain cells as you get older, and they can't be replaced. The opposite is that you can learn things, you can be better, and I think it's the same with training. I think fundamentally the reason why people who are older are in worse shape is simply because their lives are not they're just doing less. they're not exercising as much, they're not focused on their body composition, et cetera, et cetera. So it's encouraging to think that, don't assume that as you hit 40, that it's all downhill. I mean, certainly that your rates of physical development are different. And there are things that we know. I mean, anyone when I was in my 20s, I could go out, whatever, drinking and partying for 3 days straight, right? And then pitch up at work on Monday. Like now I drink a glass of red wine and I need to take the day off. So, I don't know. I don't know what is causing that, or is it just the fact that that lifestyle?
Have you been training that lifestyle?
No, maybe that's what it is. I don't drink enough red wine. I don't know.
You just don't drink enough consistently enough to not feel the effects.
Maybe that's what it is.
Yeah.
So anyway, so the point of this is, I think the main thing is actually, all of these things are stresses in your life, right? And this is, so let me talk a little bit of this. So there is another element of fatigue or recovery, which we call central nervous system fatigue. And this is kind of a little bit iffy because we talk about peripheral fatigue, and that is the local tissues, right? So if you're exercising a muscle, peripherally, you're going to build up these metabolites and you're going to fatigue, right? But you also have what they call central fatigue, which is kind of brain, spinal column, things like this, right? So central is the signal coming to your muscle to contract, and then the peripheral is your muscle contractions. But what we've discovered is that you can fatigue a muscle without the central system kicking in, i.e. you put electrodes on the muscle and get the muscle to keep contracting, and the muscle will fatigue, even though your brain is not sending the commands for your muscle to fatigue, to work. So that you can disconnect these two. What's slightly difficult is that we know for sure that the predominant reason why you cannot keep doing repeated bouts of exercise with a muscle is it fatigues peripherally, right? This is the fundamental, everything we've spoken about already. What's still being kind of debated is where this element of central fatigue comes in. And this is this kind of feeling that if you do a heavy bout of exercise, you may feel that your muscles and stuff can do more, but you just feel tired. Like you just feel that you've run out of juice somewhere. Now, what's tricky is that it appears, if you look at some studies, that this central fatigue can recover within 20 minutes of a bout of exercise. And if anything, can actually spike higher. So your central nervous system can be primed after exercise rather than depleted. So what's tricky is that I'm still trying to get hold of the information on this, because I'm quite interested in how this works, is to understand really where this central fatigue actually comes in. What is causing it, and is it more than just a kind of hearsay that if you do a certain amount of exercise, you have more central fatigue? So for instance, a lot of people think it's related to intensity. So if you do really heavy deadlifts, you're going to become more central fatigued. But actually, this is not true. What fatigues you more is high volume work. So this is still debated, and there's still studies going back and forth on whether or not this is actually mythology or not, this central fatigue that is causing people to not being able to perform. But from this show, and fundamentally what we're trying to say is actually it's the peripheral fatigue, which is the big one. That's the meat that is actually causing you to not recover. And that's what we're going to talk about in the next show. But right. I will also talk about that there are means to change this nervous system fatigue, and that this is an important part. And this is the part where there's this balance between sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous system. So hopefully that will be interesting for you guys to hear about how you can directly impact that. And also by impacting this parasympathetic system, you can potentially recover much faster.
Yeah. You reminded me of something, but you reminded me that we had a question that we were going to answer beforehand. But I think that we'll answer the question. But do you have anything else to
No, I think
to say about why recovery is important before we, tell climbers to go measure their data for a month, go track themselves, and then
no, I
next
think,
month?
yeah, I think that's I don't have any juicy. Oh no, here's an interesting random quote here. This was about people the risk of sudden cardiac death after exercise, right? So apparently there's an estimated 1 death occurring for every 1.5 million bouts of exercise in men, right? And it is even more rare with women. So with women, there's 1 death for every 36.5 million hours. That's the difference between bouts of exercise in men and hours of exercise in women. So, yeah, that's quite a big difference there. So whether that means, I don't know. But anyway, I pulled that quote off a paper. But it was just about the fact that there was a vulnerability, a very, very rare vulnerability where you have someone doing, long endurance and then they get a heart attack at the end of it. But that from the paper, that was caused not from lack of recovery, but by some abnormality in the system, like a heart defect or platelet that's coming off or something. Yeah.
There's somebody listening right now saying, well, that's all the evidence I need not to exercise anymore. one in a 3.5 million chance. That's not going to risk it.
That's right.
So we had one question from somebody emailed me in regards to the episode on supplements.
Oh, cool.
So yeah, Daniel wrote that he had a quick question, and he wrote, I was somewhat surprised to not hear that BCAAs were not on your list of recommended supplements. Currently take BCAAs on workout days. Is there a reason you did not include them on the list? Are they not effective? And then he has some a follow-up about creatine that I think we addressed and that I had emailed him back about. I was reminded of this question, which again, normally we're going to try to answer questions at the beginning of the show, really, catch your interest, but and I guess as a better segue from the last episode, but I just plumb forgot this time. So addressing it now, and the reason I was reminded is I had read in the past, this is probably 6 years ago, that BCAAs were investigated for their role in decreasing central nervous fatigue.
Oh, right.
Because I think that they found that there was maybe a potential role. Basically, the idea was that when blood BCAA levels dip, then it encourages the uptake of tryptophan, which becomes serotonin, which uptake of tryptophan by your brain, which becomes serotonin, which makes you tired. And that was the hypothesis anyway.
So it was to block the tryptophan.
Yeah, it was essentially if you keep your BCAAs, your blood levels of BCAAs high, then you block the uptake of tryptophan because the BCAAs are available instead. That this isn't to answer Daniel's question. This is why I was reminded of it. The conclusion, that, as far as I know, of what those studies or that path of investigation found was that just a protein in general is more effective, and carbohydrates. Carbohydrates will more effectively keep your BCAA levels high because you're reducing the breakdown and the oxidation of amino acids and during exercise. So I gotta drink a little bit of water. So do you want to start the
sure. So I would recommend, Daniel, that there's 2 things you can do. The short thing you can do is if you go to YouTube and Google are BCAAs useful for climbers, or rather go to our ClimbSci channel, you'll see I snipped out our short conversation on BCAAs and put it into a separate video on YouTube. So that's one place to go. I would recommend you listen to episode 1. And on our website, ClimbSci.com, there's some time codes. So you could jump to the BCAA section there. But we talk a lot about it. But fundamentally, in a very quick sense, BCAAs are found in the branched chain amino acids are found in whole protein sources. So meat, fish, poultry, beans. Legumes, vegetables that are high in, basically anything that has whole protein has the branched chain amino acids. Branched chain amino acids became popular as a supplement because of one Italian who was looking at some muscle markers back in the early 90s. What we know is that the most useful of the BCAAs, which we cover in the protein thing, is the amino acid leucine. So very briefly, this is trying to be brief. The reason that we don't recommend BCAAs is that there really is no reason to consume BCAA performance because the data on it is just not good. We don't feel there's any reason to consume BCAAs as a supplement for protein because it's not a complete protein. And the other two amino acids, isoleucine and valine, we don't really have much data on them doing anything really that significant. The most important one is the leucine. And if you just have leucine on its own, or with these other two, is that it's not even very good at doing anything because it will stimulate muscle protein synthesis, which is going to be good for recovery, but you don't have any of the other building blocks for protein. So in a sense, BCAAs are an incomplete protein source. And if people who take BCAAs to, say, for instance, mitigate muscle loss, for instance, during a fast or during exercise, the reason that they prevent muscle loss is not necessarily because of the protein, the amino acids, but actually because leucine itself will stimulate insulin, and it's the insulin that actually blocks muscle protein breakdown. And you can have the same effect by consuming a little bit of carbohydrate, which has the added benefit of giving you energy, where the BCAAs won't. So, I mean, what's very weird is that BCAAs honestly appear to be like some weird over-marketed supplement that has just stayed around for ages. Put it like this. I mean, I have strong opinion on this, and I put this in a forum the other day. I even said that I think it is almost like immoral for a good supplement company to sell BCAAs because all they're selling them for is for profit, because the science isn't there for them doing anything beneficial. They're just making money by selling them because people will buy them. But anyways, that's me. Hey,
I think you nailed it. The second part of his question was, should I drop BCAAs for creatine? Because that was so highly recommended, and I would say absolutely.
Yeah, I mean, they're two different. As you heard in the podcast, they're doing two different things. But if you have your BCAAs, by all means use them. Don't just chuck your money away. But Brian and I just cannot. I literally cannot think of any good reason to use BCAAs. The only thing I can think of where they could be beneficial is if you're a vegan or a vegetarian and you have some BCAAs in your bag and you're eating like a vegan sandwich that has, let's say, 8 grams of protein, and you want to, as we showed it in the podcast before, you want to try and get roughly 30 grams of protein, or basically a little bit more than 2 grams of leucine, and your sandwich is only going to give you, say, 1 gram of leucine, then you can neck down a glass of your BCAAs with your sandwich that makes your sandwich a better protein source. That I can see as a benefit to using BCAAs. But once you've finished your tub, I would spend your money and find a really good whole protein source, whether it is a vegan, vegetarian protein powder, like a whole protein source, or a whey protein. All the studies that have shown benefit of supplemental protein has been a whole protein source. So yeah, it's there are some papers and supplement companies will say, but look, it's improved performance here and here. It's like, it's scant. It's really, it is an overhyped supplement. I really think. It's not worth it.
It's scant evidence, and the evidence disappears the moment that you compare it to something that's more effective, like carbohydrates or a whole protein. Right. So it might show a benefit, and this is something I talk a lot about in regards to a lot of supplements in general. But there's pretty much anything you put in your body in isolation will show some sort of improvement or some mark change. But that's not really what our standard is. Our standard now is, does it do it better than something else that is readily available and oftentimes cheaper? So do BCAAs do something that a whole protein or a carbohydrate cannot do? And the answer is no, they can't. Like Tom said, if you particularly if you're vegan or vegetarian, if you have a lower quality protein meal or just a lower protein meal, you can use BCAAs to supplement that. You could have, like if you have 20 grams of quinoa, that's not going to get you quite enough, or 20 grams. If you get 20 grams of protein from quinoa, it's not going to get you quite enough leucine to be as beneficial as 20 grams of protein from a better source. And you could have some BCAAs and get more benefit out of it then. Alternatively, you could just have like half a scoop more quinoa, or you could add like half a scoop of a protein powder, or you could add some other higher leucine vegan source. There's just so many other better ways around it that don't involve adding the most bitter supplement that you've ever tasted into your diet.
Yeah, but yeah, I would recommend you have a look, listen to the full podcast, because we really explain the loose. Okay, hold on 1 second. I'm just finishing up with like 2 minutes, and then I'll finish. So you can carry on. So it's just the cleaner for the office has just arrived, which I thought. So, but that's good. It will force us to finish the show. So
yeah, perfect. Well, that is part 1 of recovery, the part where we tell you that recovery is important, but don't tell you how to do it better. Next month, final Friday of next month, we will release another podcast, Recovery Part 2, ClimbSci Episode 7, in which we will tell you in intricate detail what you, as a climber, can do nutritionally, physically, mentally, we'll see, to improve your recovery, both, in between sessions and potentially during sessions themselves. Make sure, if you have questions about today's episode, do please write them in. You can write them in on, the ClimbSci does not have a Facebook page, but you can write them in on my website's Facebook page, which is facebook.com/climbingnutrition. You can also, I will be posting an article on my site just with the links. You can post the question there. You can post any questions you have in the YouTube comments or in the SoundCloud comments. You can email me a question. If you email it to me, then Tom does not get to see it until I send it to him, which sometimes I forget to do. So that's
it's exciting for me then.
It's exciting for Tom because he gets to hear about the questions literally 2 seconds before he gets to answer them. I knew that he had a good answer to BCA, so it's a question that we deal with all the time.
Yep.
So write your questions in is the bottom line in any method that you choose. You could even send me a postcard if you know my address.
Cool. Good. Do you want to show your what you're wearing?
Hey, yeah. I've started screen printing, so let me turn this down. This is
the beta version.
Yep. This is the ClimbSci monocolor bitmapped onto a t-shirt. It's a slightly too large t-shirt for myself, but that's because I gave all the other medium t-shirts. I let some of my friends take them as, hopefully they'll model for me to later show it. And I'm going to be sending a shirt to Tom as well. Figured I probably shouldn't pre-wear the shirt for him.
Yeah.
So,
okay. Anyways,
but,
I have to go, Brian, because the cleaner's going to get angry with me. So,
all right. Well, it was great talking with you as always, Tom.
thank you.
Write those questions in, everyone. Make sure to subscribe, like our podcast. Tom's got better info on all of that.
Sure, put a review out and things like that. On iTunes, if you love it and stuff like that. But thanks so much, everybody, for listening. This is the ClimbSci gang.
I'm not. We'll find a better nickname for ourselves in the future. I'm not putting that in a pen.
Okay. All right. Thanks, guys. Thanks for listening. See you next week, next month.
ClimbSci gang signing out.